Over the last few years, my workflow has slowly outgrown my setup. I've been editing on the same PC for years now. It never really was a powerhouse, but it was enough to get me started off with editing and rising through the ranks in CSGO. Then, about a year ago, I made the leap and bought a new camera, the Sony a7S Mark III. Quickly, my footage got heavier and my system got slower. I realized I was spending more time waiting than creating. For some context, I built my last PC in 2019. It was housed inside the NZXT H500i, running an Asus ROG Strix B450F motherboard, a Ryzen 5 2600, and 16GB of Corsair Vengeance RGB Pro at 3200MHz. Power came from a 550W PSU, and the graphics card was a Gigabyte GTX 1660 Ti. It was a solid mid-range build for its time, definitely enough to get me into editing and gaming, but once I started working with that 4K 10-bit 422 footage, it started to fall behind. So that's when I started planning a new build, not just for performance but for aesthetics too, because I genuinely feel more creative when my space is inspiring. So that's it, my first full white PC build, made for editing and to be a showpiece. Now, I'll say this up front, I'm not a PC building expert. I wasn't trying to squeeze out every ounce of price to performance. I just really wanted something powerful enough to be able to handle my workflow and aesthetic enough that I'd want to sit down and use it every day. Alright, let's take a look at the parts for the new PC build. I went with a Ryzen 9 7900X. It's got 12 cores, great performance for video work, and it gave me headroom without completely killing my budget. The motherboard is the Gigabyte X870 Aorus Elite Ice. It's got a white PCB, and honestly the main selling point here was just how gorgeous it looks. For cooling, I wanted something quiet but visual, so I went with Corsair's iCUE Link Titan 360, partly for the performance, but for that LCD screen as well. I'm pairing it with 32GB of Corsair Vengeance DDR5 RAM at 6000MHz. I think that's going to be more than enough for my current projects, but I can always upgrade later on if I need to. For storage, I went with two 1TB SN850Xs, fast Gen 4 M.2 SSDs. One for my operating system and apps, and the other for short-term project footage. I'm pairing all of this with the MSI RTX 5070 Gaming Trio OC in white, which I absolutely love the look of. The power supply is the NZXT C850. It's got white fully modular sleeved cables out of the box. And the case is the Hyte Y70 Snow White. It's a stunning dual chamber design with 3 tempered glass surfaces, and I've wanted to build in this case for the longest time, so now I have a reason. Finally, for airflow, I'm sticking with the Corsair ecosystem here with this mix of regular and reverse blade LX120s to keep everything daisy chained and minimal. So those are all the new parts I'm going to be building with. If all goes to plan, this is going to be an insane upgrade and I can't wait to get started. With all the parts ready to go, it's finally time to build. First up, let's get the Y70 case unboxed and up on the build table. So the Y70 is made up of 3 tempered glass panels with that angled middle panel for a nicer viewing angle inside. And this was actually one of the first things that caught my eye about this case. The 2 bigger panels snap off without any screws, but I did need to remove 4 small screws to get that angled piece out. There's a built-in GPU riser in the Y70, which was another selling point for me. Tool-free drive storage compartments and rubber grommets across the back chamber. With all the panels removed, this case is going to be a breeze to build in. Alright, kicking off the build, let's unbox the Gigabyte X70 Aorus Elite Ice. And yeah, I don't want to dwell on specs, just look at this thing. Basically, everything from DIMM slots to rear I/O are all white, so this motherboard is going to fit the theme so well. Now, this is probably the most nerve-wracking part of the whole build, which is installing the Ryzen 9 7900X CPU, but you'll be glad to know that it's actually as simple as dropping it into place and giving it a little wiggle to make sure it's seated properly. Next, I'm going to install my 32GB of Corsair Vengeance Pro RGB RAM. I've opened the 2nd and 4th DIMM slots as this is recommended for optimal performance, but be sure to double check with your own build. Pushing down until I hear that satisfying click and we can move on to storage. Like I mentioned, for now I'm just installing 2 1TB SSDs, but I do plan on expanding this in future, so I've got room for long-term video storage as well as a separate drive for my games. At this point, I've installed everything onto the motherboard, so it's time to get it fitted into the Y70. It was as simple as slotting it into place and screwing down into the standoffs, and we're able to get a first glimpse at how this build is coming together, and I'm liking it a lot. Alright, let's shift attention to cooling, and starting off, I'm going to be installing the Corsair iCUE Link Titan 360 LCD. I went for this AIO because it's got that LCD screen with a soft diffused cover and integrates seamlessly into the iCUE system and matches the fans I've gone for. Everything comes pre-installed here, so once screwed onto the removable plate from the Y70, I just dropped it down into place. And tell me this isn't one of the coolest thermal paste patterns you've seen. Once screwed into place, I pulled off the plastics, always the most satisfying moment, and then moved on to the rest of the fans. Unsurprisingly, I went with Corsair's LX120s across the board. They daisy chain together nice and easy, and I'm going to be able to control all 10 fans as well as my pump head and ram sticks through this little device, the iCUE Link. I started off by installing the bottom 3 intake fans. These were a bit awkward to fit, but eventually I got them in. Next, I installed 3 more along the side panel, and this time it was super easy. I finished off with the rear single fan, and I actually meant to order a reverse blade, so I had to flip the fan around, which didn't look quite as good, but you'll be able to see more of that when the build is finished. Alright, I think it's time to move on what's going to be supplying all of these parts. The NZXT C850 in white. I chose this PSU because it comes with fully modular, all white sleeved cables, which I think are going to make the finished product look that much cleaner. I just slotted it into the back of the case, screwed it in before tackling the most fun part of any build, the cable management. So I started routing the cables, but I won't show too much of this because it's not exactly thrilling content. But I will say that it turned out way easier than I was expecting, and I put that largely down to how much space we've got to work with in the Y70. And finally, the centerpiece, the GPU. I went with the MSI RTX 5070 Gaming Trio OC in white. Now, I have to say, I had a hard time choosing GPU, but I could not be happier with what I landed on. The all-white look just looks so nice to me, and it's going to be perfect for this build. Installation was pretty simple too. I plugged in the riser cable and then set the GPU in place. MSI provided this splitter cable, which I got plugged in, and there we have it. Once I got everything installed, I could finally step back and just take in what I just built. And let me tell you, I've impressed myself with this one. The white team came together better than I imagined. So all that was left to do was get the glass panels back installed on the case, and the most satisfying part of all. So, with everything installed, cabled and sealed up, it's time to bring the build over into the main setup. And scratch what I said earlier, this might actually be the most nerve-wracking part of the whole process. I hit the power button, a little bit of initial whirring, and just like that, it booted to life. First try. And that's it. I genuinely couldn't be happier with how this build came together. I switched all the lighting over to match that clean white theme I've been going for, and honestly, it just looks so good in the setup. As for performance, compared to my old PC, well, it's night and day. In fact, I edited this entire video on the new build, and it was the smoothest editing experience I've had in years. I'm seriously proud of how it turned out, but what do you think? Let me know in the comments. If you're new here, feel free to stick around. There's loads more content coming, and now that I've got a machine that can keep up with it, it's only going to get easier to make.